Been a minute since I stood up here, so I just want to refresh you all where we're at. We are in First Kings, and it was about Elijah the last time. When you guys think about Elijah, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about the prophet Elijah? He did 7 miracles or even more, but there's 7 major ones that I want to point out today. Anyone think of something Elijah did? Nothing? Elijah, first he caused a drought by shutting up heaven. Remember, came to King Ahab and said, because you're worshiping idols, it's not going to rain. Then what did Elijah do? He left. It was no rain, so there's no food. So what was his second miracle? He multiplied the oil and flour for himself and the widow. It did not run out for many days, it says. Then what happened? The widow's son died, but he didn't die from starvation. What did he die from? Just sickness. And what did Elijah do? He resurrected him. Then Elijah, remember, he said, we're going to go up on the mountain and we're going to prove who the real God is. So he defeated the prophets of Baal with fire from heaven, and it consumed everything, the offering, the wood, the rocks, the water. So we see Elijah had a great ministry, a great calling on him. Then after all of that, he said, this is the one true God. And he said, let it rain. Remember, a little cloud came and it rained. Then he was so excited, he outran Ahab's horses and chariots back to Jezreel, back to the city. But Jezebel became so angry because he killed all her prophets that she threatened to kill him as well. And that's where we see the human part of Elijah come in. What did Elijah do? He became scared, right? So he ran off. He put his running shoes back on. As fast as he ran down, she said, I'm going to kill you. He put his running shoes back on and ran back into the mountain to hide. Now, I left off last time with God showing him 3 things. So first it was the wind. Let's see, let me get it in order here. There came a great wind, then the earthquake, then the fire, and then a still small voice. Where was God? In that still small voice, right? Did God tell Elijah to run away from Jezebel? No. So when he came to him, he said, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah said, well, I'm the only prophet left. They've killed all the other ones with the sword, and now they're about to kill me. So God showed him how powerful and strong he is with the wind, with the fire, with the earthquake. And after he showed him all those things, in a still small voice, he talked to him. And again, he asked him, Elijah, what are you doing here? And he gave him the same exact answer as the first time God asked him what he was doing here. So I think God seeing that Elijah was scared, he wasn't listening to the still small voice, so he said, okay, Elijah, it's time for you to go down to Damascus, and Elisha is going to take your place. Because God can't work with someone who doesn't obey or listen to his still small voice, right? If I told you, Micah, take out the trash, and you run the other way, the trash is still there to be taken out. If you're not listening to what I say, then I say, okay, Kyle, can you take out the trash for me? And then if someone obeys, that's what God's looking for, is someone to be obedient. And Elijah did a lot of miracles, but this Jezebel was just too scary for him. So he wasn't listening to the still small voice. But then God encouraged him. He was so depressed up on that mountain. He said, just kill me up here, God. And God said, listen, go. I still have a plan for you. And he had a wonderful plan. Elijah did a lot of good things for God. Don't get me wrong. It was just way at the end, he buckled kind of. And I think every one of us would if we're only human and we don't trust God all the way. So he went and he encouraged him. He said, listen, Elijah, there are still 7,000 people who did not bow their knees to Baal. So Elijah was encouraged that he wasn't the only one, that God does protect his people. He thought everyone was dead. So he got enough courage to go down into Damascus, and he departed. And down in Damascus, there was Elisha. Elijah and Elisha. Or Elisha, however you want to say it. He was a farmer. He was out in the field, and it says he had 12 yoke of oxen. Here we only see 2. I think he only owned 2, but all the neighbors would come together. They would hitch up all their oxen. He had 12 pairs, and he was plowing up the ground. What does Elijah do? Elijah comes down, sees Elisha plowing, and he walks past him and throws his mantle on him. He doesn't even say anything, just throws his mantle on him and keeps walking. Well, Elisha stops plowing, turns around and says, wait a minute, can I first, let's see. He left his oxen and ran after Elijah. So we see that he dropped his mantle, threw his mantle on him and walked away. And he ran after him and said, let me, I pray thee, kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow thee. He said, I'll follow you, but I want to say goodbye to everyone. And Elijah said, go back. What have I done unto thee? Well, he just threw his mantle on him. And Elisha knew what that meant. But Elijah was, I don't know if he was testing him or what. So he returned back from him, and Elisha showed him how serious he was from following him. Guess what he did with these 2 oxen? He offered them up. He says, he boiled their flesh with the instruments of the oxen, gave it unto the people, and they did eat. So with the yoke and everything, he burned everything. He said, I am done farming. I'm going to be a prophet. So he couldn't go back to farming if he wanted to. Remember Peter and some of the disciples, after Jesus left them, they said, why don't we just go back fishing? Well, he wasn't going to go back to farming, not after Elijah threw his mantle on him. He knew, and God had a special thing for Elisha because he knew that he wanted to follow him, but he had a lot to learn. So he arose and he went after Elijah and he served him. So while Elijah and Elisha were out learning the ways of God, guess what that evil queen Jezebel and Ahab were up to? They were still up to their wicked ways. And Ahab, to tell you what kind of king he was, there was a vineyard outside his palace. Naboth had inherited it from his fathers. And it takes a lot to grow grapes and to harvest them and tend it. But Ahab wanted it so bad, and he asked him if he can have it. And Naboth said, no, I don't want to sell it to you. What did the king do? He went in on his bed and he threw a little brat fit. He wouldn't eat. And Jezebel came in and said, why are you not eating? He said, oh, I want that vineyard so bad. So she said, I have a plan. And guess what her plan was? If he wouldn't sell it to her, this is why Elijah was scared of her. Naboth wouldn't sell it. So what did she do? She set people up to say that he blasphemed God, and they took him outside. They took Naboth outside the city and stoned him. They killed him. Then Jezebel said, okay, king, you can have your vineyard now. Well, God sees everything. He was not going to let Ahab and Jezebel get away with that. So while Elijah and Elisha were out in the wilderness, he said, hey, you need to go talk to Ahab. He just killed Naboth. And Ahab just went down into the vineyard to possess it and look after it and pat himself on the shoulder that he got what he wanted. And Elijah said, listen, you're not going to get away with this. He said, the same place that you have killed Naboth, where his blood is, the dogs are going to lick up your blood from the same exact spot. And he said that evil queen Jezebel, the dogs are going to eat her up outside the city wall. And that is exactly what happened. The king, how are we going to get the king to eat? How are we going to get the dogs to drink his blood? He's the king. Well, there was a great war going on, and he asked all those fake prophets, am I going to win the war if I go out? They said, oh yeah, you'll win. He said, well, ask this other prophet that talks about God if I'm going to win. The other prophet said, no, you're not going to win. He said, see, you always talk evil of me. He said, well, that's what God told me. So he disguised himself not as the king, but as a regular warrior, because he knew the other people would come after the king to try to kill him. He told another guy, wear your robes. And they went out to battle. Once they seen the king wasn't Jehoshaphat, wasn't the king, they weren't going to kill him. But some random guy drew his bow back and shot into the crowd, into the group of warriors, and it hit Ahab right between the shoulders, I think. And he started bleeding. And he told his armor bearer, take me up on this chariot. I'm wounded. So he sat up on the chariot and he watched the battle go on all day. And that evening, you only have so much blood. So he died. Now, he was way out in the mountains or in the battlefield, and God said the dogs are going to lick up his blood in the same place as Naboth. Guess how that happened? When Ahab died, they took the chariot over to that pool of water right outside Samaria and washed the chariot off and his armor and everything, and the blood ran on the ground in the same exact spot, and the dogs came up and licked up the blood. So God watches out for us. God does protect us, and everything he says is true. So if we learn to obey him, even if it's hard things like facing a Jezebel, he will still protect us. So we're going to keep reading. So we are in 1 Kings, let's see, 19. I think I read that. So we're done with 1 Kings. We jump over into 2 Kings because Elisha was now anointed, and they were together, and he started seeing what Elijah was doing, but Elijah was becoming old, and it was time for Elisha to take over. And it came to pass in chapter 2, when the Lord would take up Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind, that Elijah went with Elisha from Gilgal. So they were over in Gilgal, and Elijah told Elisha, listen, I want to go to Bethel. I'm going to go over to Bethel. You stay here. And Elijah said, I'm not staying here. As surely as the Lord lives, I'm going with you. So they went over to Bethel. Once they got into Bethel, then I don't know how long they stayed, but there were some prophets there, and they told Elisha, did you know your master is going up to heaven today? He said, I know, but don't say it so loud. So I don't know why I don't know why, if he thought that Elijah didn't know that he was going to die today, or not die actually, go up to heaven, or why he wanted to keep it a secret, but he wanted to follow him. So Elijah said, let's go over to Jericho. And he said, you stay here. And Elisha said, I'm not staying here. I'm following you. So they went over to Jericho. Now they were over at Jericho. And Elijah was trying to get away from Elisha, and he could not get away. So he said, hey, listen, I'm going down to the Jordan River. Why don't you stay here? He knew that Elisha likes to stay in towns rather than the wilderness. So he said, I'm going down to the Jordan. Why don't you stay here? Elisha would not leave him alone. He followed him down there to the Jordan. Finally, Elijah sees he's not going to get away from Elisha. So he said, well, they were standing on the edge of the Jordan, and there were 50-some prophets watching them. They knew that Elijah was going to go, and they were watching them, and they wanted to get away and be by themselves. So Elijah took his mantle, he smote the water, because it was a lot bigger river than this. This looks like they could step over, but it was a big river. And he smote the rivers, and the waters parted on both sides, and they could cross over to the other side and get away from all the people. Now I think they were by themselves, and the waters went back, so no one could follow them. And they were over there all by themselves, and Elijah knew it was time to go home. So he looked at Elisha and he said, you're going to follow me, obviously. So what do you want? What shall I do for thee before I be taken away? And Elisha said, let a double portion of thy spirit be upon me. Now, he wasn't being greedy. He wasn't saying, give me twice as much as what you have. In the Old Testament, the Jewish people, if they had a firstborn, they would give them double portion of what all the others had. So he was just asking for what everyone else. He said, you're going to go up, you're going to be taken away, I'm going to be left. So I want a double portion of what you have. But he said, of your spirit, a double portion of thy spirit be upon me. And Elijah said, you ask a hard thing, because it's God who's going to give him the double portion, I believe. So he said, but listen, if you see me when I'm taken away, like you're following me all the way, I've been trying to get away from me. So if you see me when I'm taken away, God will grant your wish. But if you don't, then it will not be so. So they were walking and talking along, and all of a sudden, there came chariots of fire down from heaven, and it went right, because Elisha was not being separated from Elijah, and it came right in between the two, and it made him step aside. Then after they were departed, Elijah was in the chariot, and off the same chariot went up into heaven and out of sight. And Elisha said, my father, and he tore his clothes. He was all by himself. He tore his clothes. But Elijah left something behind, and it was his coat or his mantle. That did not go up to heaven with him. And Elisha picked it up, and I think he was still mourning. He walked over to the river, the same river he wanted to cross back over, but it was full of water. So Elisha smote the river, and he said, where is the God of Elijah? And the same river departed for Elisha. Then, because he seen him go, because the river parted, he knew, and all the prophets that were standing on the other side said, the Spirit of God, or the Spirit of Elijah, rests on Elisha. And they all bowed down, and he was their new prophet. So he went into the town. On the other side, they said, well, where did Elijah go? They didn't see him go up to heaven. And he said, well, he's gone. They said, well, what if God took him and just threw him on the other side of the mountain to die? He said, don't go look for him. But they said, please, just let us go look for him. So he said, all right, go. And they went and they looked for 3 days in the mountains, everywhere they could think, 50 people. They could not find Elijah anywhere, because Elijah had gone up to heaven to be with God. He wasn't on the other side of the rock dying or something. So when they came back to Jericho, Elisha said, see, I told you not to go. So they were like, well, we're in Jericho. We need a prophet in here because all of our water is bad. How do we get good water? And Elisha said, well, let me perform my second miracle. Bring me some salt. He brought salt and he sprinkled in the water, and all the waters were healed. They could drink it. We know we can't drink salt water, but because God had told him, so we can see that small voice that told Elijah what to do was now telling Elisha what to do, and he obeyed, and the Spirit of God rested upon him, and the land was healed, the water was healed. Many good things were happening if you were on Elisha's side. Now, there were some young youth or children who were not on Elisha's side, and Elisha was going back up the mountain, probably to talk to God, just to spend some time alone. And it says these youth started yelling at him, saying, go up, you bald head. They started mocking him. Well, Elisha turned around and he cursed them. And guess what happened? Does anyone know the story? No one knows the story? It's kind of a scary ending. 2 bears came out of the woods, and it says they tore up those 50 children. Now, how many? 42, was it? I was getting mixed up with the 50 prophets. I think let me see. 42 children, that's right. So, why did the bear chew them up? I didn't want to scare you guys, but it is It is good to know that God does protect him. And if the Spirit rests on him, obviously, if they were mocking Elisha, they were not on God's side. So what we want to do is be on God's side. So I didn't know how to end this story, because we see where I don't know how old these little children or youth were, but I bet they were accountable for themselves. So they're probably older than you guys. Probably some of the youth that are sitting in the back is probably their age, is what I would guess. But because he cursed them, he would not curse someone who's on his side. So how do we live? What we want to do is how are we living our lives? So let's go back and see an example in the Old Testament. Let's go back to Moses. He was a great leader, but he failed to obey. And if we fail to obey God, what was God's punishment to Moses? He could not cross over this Jordan River because he struck the rock. So number one thing, we want to obey. We want to learn how to obey. So who took Moses' place? Joshua. Where did it? It was the Jordan River. They passed. Moses could not go into the promised land. Now we keep coming to this story of today. Elijah ran from Jezebel. See, that was disobedience. So God said, well, I'm going to pass the mantle on to Elisha. Where did it happen? The Jordan River. Let's fast forward to the New Testament. John the Baptist. Guess where John the Baptist baptized people? The Jordan River. And who got baptized at the Jordan River? Jesus. Remember, the Spirit came down upon him like a dove. We're going to say the mantle came upon Jesus. Now, who did Jesus teach or disciple? Just like Elijah taught Elisha, Jesus had disciples following him around. I just said it. They were disciples. They followed him around. He taught them. After Jesus died, the Holy Spirit came upon the disciples. Now, the disciples teach somebody. Who are they teaching? See how the mantle just keeps going down and down and down? We are taught by them. The disciples wrote the Bible, right? They wrote things in the Bible for us to follow. And in 1 Peter 2:9, it says, you are a chosen generation. You are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should go forth and show forth the praises of him who has called you out of darkness into the marvelous light. So just like Elijah picked Elisha, he's seen something special in him. Jesus seen something special in his disciples. The disciples see something special in everyone who believes in God. So I'm going to end with Isaiah 61:10. It says, I will greatly rejoice in the Lord, for he has clothed me with the garments of salvation. He has covered me with the robe of righteousness. So how do we put on that mantle or that robe? If Elisha picked up the one that Elijah left, how do we pick up the one that Jesus or the disciples left for us? How do we grab hold of that? By believing. If we believe, then that mantle, God, the Holy Spirit can come upon us. And sometimes, like Elijah, when first happens, he asks, where is the God? And he struck the river and God showed himself to him. So if you don't fully understand or believe, ask God, how do you do this? It's okay to question, like, where are you? And he'll reveal himself to you. But the big thing is, he knew that he was called. He went ahead and picked it up. So you have to believe and understand, and at least try to understand it. And then you can ask God, where are you? And he'll show you. So with that, we will end.